Way out west, out in this paddock, seemingly miles from anywhere, lies this lonely grave. But what is it doing out here? Way out in the Mallee. And what is the story?
Is he a pioneering hero? Or is there another side to the story?
This is a story that takes us across the state.
It's a bit of a poignant moment here. I'm driving along through the very country where John Coppock found himself all those years ago.
A shipwreck. An old pub. A famous station. And what are the secrets that are left hidden on these windswept hills?
There's been a team researching with me, digging through books and archives, looking for original sources, trying to track down the actual truth.
Unanswered questions.
There's some controversy over whether he was John Coppock, the free settler, or John Coppock, the convict.
And controversy.
The murder of so many of Mr. Faithful's men has spread great consternation over the settlement.
Can one man be both a hero and a villain? And is that perhaps our story too?
G'day, I'm Matt. I grew up here in the Wimmera. And on this channel I've been telling a few stories using the old 16mm footage Dad and his brothers took. Our family, like many from this area, have a lot of history here. We're descended from the early European pioneers. This is my great-grandparents, somewhere around 1880. So I've been making another video focused on the pioneer story. I'd taken a trip to the local Japarrit Pioneer Museum. Okay, hello, how you going?
Marianne.
Oh, hi Marianne, nice to meet you. And I met Craig Proctor.
I'm Craig Proctor, currently Secretary of the Wimmera Mallee Pioneer Museum.
And there I had a good look at the amazing historic buildings they have on site. And right amongst them, Albacutya Station, the region's first sheep station. Goes right back to the mid-1800s. And it was here I first learned about the bloke who owned the station, John Coppock.
And so Craig took me on a drive beyond the town of Rainbow, over a railway line and down a dirt road called Jack's Track. And there it was, standing all alone. The grave of John Coppock. And Craig shared more about this old pioneer.
He arrived in the Wimmera in the 1840s and established his successful Albacutya run, a 1,000-acre pastoral lease north of what became Rainbow and south of what is now Albacutya.
And I learned a bit about his life at Albacutya Station.
This is the log hut and the kitchen in particular where John Coppock spent the last 19 years of his life living at Albacutya Station.
Homestead complex that he built really does reflect the life of early settlers in the Wimmera Mallee region. Dirt floor, gaps in all the boards, the walls and the roof. John Coppock's workers would gather to eat and talk with the boss sitting at the head of the table and carving the meat.
I was curious, who was this bloke? What was his story?
And suddenly I discovered an absolute can of worms.
Pretty remote area when he came here, right?
Oh, totally remote. There were encounters with the local Indigenous people.
When you say encounters with Indigenous Australians, do we know to what level, or were there issues there, and what do we know anything about that side of the story?
I think we can assume that there were encounters. To what extent there was conflict is not known with any degree of certainty.
Turns out there was a lot more to John's story.
So let's go on a journey and we'll see where it takes us. And a warning, this story does have discussions of violence involving both Indigenous communities and the European settlers.
Some of the language and viewpoints presented reflect the attitudes of the time. While now considered offensive or inappropriate, they are included for historical accuracy
and to better understand the context of the past. Some of this video could be traumatic for people as we reflect on the deep loss experienced by First Nations people during this era of colonisation. I didn't even really want to tell this story or go down this path, given how sensitive these topics are. But this was the story that presented itself, and I felt I had to share it and not just ignore it or cover it up. But I'll be aiming to present both sides of the story too, in a respectful way. So the first clues about John's life are on his gravestone, in memory of John Coppock. When John died in 1865, it was his nephew John Coppock White, JCW, who was working for him that inherited his estate. And 20 years later, JCW took the time to write a couple of articles about his uncle. And if you search on Trove, these are the first things you'll find. A bunch of his story is written there, but the articles do lead to more questions. And was everything written there by his nephew the full story?
We'll let John Coppock White start the story.
The hero of the following narrative of facts, John Coppock, will doubtless be well remembered by many old colonists still living in Victoria and New South Wales. He was an early colonist, having arrived in the latter colony in the year 1829, and was among the first free emigrants who came to Port Jackson.
So according to JCW, John Coppock arrives in 1829 as a free settler. If ever there was a story of adventure, this was it. Coming out to what they considered the end of the earth, to a fringe settlement in the Australian bush. Now in 1836, a Sussex squire and capitalist, William Henry Yaldwin, travelled to Australia to make his fortune. And so somewhere at this point, he meets John Coppock and decides to hire him as the supervisor of his brand new sheep station.
So in early 1837, Coppock takes charge of the expedition, starting from the Goulburn Yass area. He buys 4,000 young ewes in lamb from Goulburn, along with 2 teams of bullocks, horses, rations, tools, firearms, everything he needs. Got to remember at this time in Australia, from a European perspective, this is going out to the absolute fringes of society. It's frontier.
But of course, there were already a vast number of Indigenous groups, each with their own rich cultures and histories. It's easy to imagine that European settlers had little understanding of the depth and the diversity of these communities.
So Coppock needs workers, and this is an important part of the story we have to factor in. Who can he use to work for him? 21 assigned servants were secured. Ticket to leave men, basically convicts on parole, given permission to work under supervision. They were given freedom to live and work in the community, but they had to follow a few rules. They had to stay in a specified area, attend church on Sundays. It sounds like they were not the brightest or the best. In 1837, a British Parliamentary Select Committee published a report.
In the formation of these settlements, it does not appear that the territorial rights of the natives were considered, and very little care has since been taken to protect them from the violence or the contamination of the dregs of our countrymen.
So they set off, heading towards Victoria. At the time they called it the Port Phillip district of New South Wales. In 1837, Melbourne itself was just a small settlement on the Yarra River, a rough makeshift town with wooden huts, tents, but it was starting to be a hub for the growing wool industry, attracting settlers and traders. Following what was known as Major Mitchell's Line. The trek the explorer took in 1836, apparently the wagon marks were still showing from where he'd gone through.
And they make it to the Murray River and then later the Goulburn and meet the famous explorer John Eyre.
Mr. Yalbone's party were also encamped on the banks of the river and in a great dilemma, not knowing how to cross it. I launched my boat and soon got all my sheep and baggage over. The cattle we swam over. I lent my boat to Mr. Yalbone's party, who were thus enabled to cross as well, but which I think they never would have accomplished without such aid. Before we came up, one of Mr. Yalbone's party had tried to cross the Goulburn on horseback, but both rider and horse were drowned. I found with Mr. Yalbone's party 2 little black boys about 8 years old. The overseer did not know what to do with them, so I at once attached them to my own party.
So Coppock and his men continued their journey. According to his nephew, they were very worried about the dangers of the Indigenous populations.
A strong staff of men was required, not only to help in travelling, but also for protection, as they anticipated trouble with the local Aboriginal people, who were known to be warlike and treacherous.
Even that phrase, warlike and treacherous, is one of those things that historians would now argue about. Were they warlike and treacherous, or were they actually warriors defending their land from an invading force?
This is a painting by J. McFarlane titled Sturt's Party Threatened by Blacks at the junction of the Murray and Darling, 1830. But when you think about it from another perspective, should it be titled Indigenous Australian Warriors Bravely Fend Off Sturt's Party?
Having his ticket of leave men all armed apparently caused a few issues for Coppock.
The men had to be armed, which posed continual trouble for Coppock. As he soon discovered, they were an unmitigated band of ruffians, difficult to control, requiring careful management.
So in around July 1837, they finally made it and camped at a creek that they called Piper's Creek.
And this is Piper's Creek now. A beautiful, quiet creek.
It's about 8 miles from the site of Kyneton. It's a bit of a poignant moment here. I'm driving along through the very country where John Coppock found himself all those years ago, about 187 years ago. And you look around, it's beautiful country, amazing country where we're driving. You can see how Yaldwin described it in his quote.
The whole country between his station and mine is as beautiful as can be. It is the only part of the colony that ever reminded me of England. The whole distance, 12 miles, is like a nobleman's park, beautifully timbered and watered.
Yaldwin later calls the area Barfold, named after a part of his Sussex estate back home. Hudson Yards were erected at the main camp and a few outstations were formed.
The sheep had increased considerably, having lambed along the road, with a good percentage saved. At first, the Aboriginal people were shy, but when they discovered that sheep were good to eat, they became troublesome, frequently spearing sheep for the fat and wounding 3 shepherds at different times.
Sheep being stolen is something you'll read a fair bit about in these early accounts. But why was sheep being stolen?
There is a nutritious root which the indigenous people eat. It bears a beautiful yellow flower. The native name of this root is murnong.
But as the sheep came, and the cattle, they began to wipe out a whole ecosystem. They are simultaneously decimating the food supply of the indigenous populations.
Mr. Munro said there were millions of murnong or yam all over the plain, and that the kangaroos were so abundant that they came up to the door of their tent. Emu were also abundant. This was only 18 months ago. Now there are none seen. The sheep drive them away. Yet this is a proof that the natives have been deprived of a large portion of their support and subsistence.
And should we even call it stealing, when you consider the Aboriginal people didn't think about ownership the same way and consider themselves custodians of the entire land, animals included.
So the workers get themselves established, but then they hear of an incident that word of mouth had spread throughout the district with a bit of a panic.
It's Wednesday, April the 11th, 1838, near the Broken River, Benalla. James Crossley, overseer, is getting his men to yoke the bullocks, and the shepherds are organising their flocks of sheep. Suddenly, he hears a shepherd cry out,
"Murder! A man is speared!"
I saw John Bass speared in the shoulder when he fell. I saw a native drive a spear into his body, plant his foot upon him and draw it out again.
As soon as we came up, Bentley fired and the native fell, but I cannot say whether he was killed. Several shots were fired, but with what effect I do not know.
The men are now panicked and run for their lives, trying to escape. The Aboriginal people run after them, spears in hand.
We found it necessary to make our escape and commenced all running in one direction.
And one by one, the Europeans are chased down.
After running 2 miles, one of the men, William Reed, gave in and was immediately speared by the natives. We still ran on, and John Hargrave was overtaken and speared. At this time, in passing Edward Laycock, John Freeman, and William Macon, I heard them say, "Let us die together."
And by the end of it, 8 Europeans are killed and 1 Aboriginal person.
Now there's a marker at Benalla that records the spot. Near this site, April 11th, 1838, 18 of Faithful's men were attacked, their drays plundered by Aborigines. 8 of the Faithful's men and 1 Aborigine died. Now I noticed on Google Maps the site is permanently closed. Is there something controversial about this memorial?
There's a whole website called Finding Merriman that goes into great detail on many of these topics. Why did they attack? Was it a malicious attack? The reason for it is debated by historians, with some arguing it was over an earlier fight on the Ovens River, or even mistreatment of Aboriginal women.
I found this horrific quote on Trove of what the European response should be.
In the meantime, we are glad to learn that more certain means are about to be adopted to reduce the savages.
Apparently European reprisals went on for some time after this,
with an estimated 100 Aboriginal people killed. Does the wording of this memorial need a rethink to capture the full story?
Whatever the cause, it certainly had the settlers worried.
A gentleman who arrived overland from Port Phillip the other day informs us that the murder of so many of Mr. Faithful's men by the blacks on their route to Port Phillip has spread great consternation over the settlement.
And while all this is going on, back in England, there's the coronation of 18-year-old Queen Victoria.
There were millions of my loyal subjects, assembled in every spot to witness the procession. Their good humour and excessive loyalty was beyond everything. I really cannot say how proud I felt to be the queen of such a nation.
But it was out here in Australia, on the fringes of her empire, that ordinary settlers were dealing with the cold, hard reality of what this empire building looked like.
And then another event takes place. Samuel Fallon tells a story.
I am a prisoner of the Crown and came from Ireland in the ship James Lang in 1830. I am employed as shepherd to one of his flocks near Mount Macedon. Another shepherd named Thomas Jones was missing. His flock came home in the evening without him. The overseer, Mr. Robert Bell, went out with some men to look for him. I was one of the party. About half a mile from the hut, we found Jones lying dead. We found 2 large spears sticking in his body, and stomach open and the inside taken away. His clothes were torn and his hat taken away. He had also several severe cuts on the head with a blunt instrument. I have no doubt Jones was killed by blacks.
So here's the first perspective from a European point of view. You're a settler, way out in the middle of nowhere, and you are genuinely worried, frightened that you might be attacked. There's this painting that appeared years after,
Australian blacks stealing on a shepherd.
but it kind of sums up the feeling of the time. With all these incidents, the Europeans are keen to establish their innocence.
I do not know what has caused the natives to behave in this manner. I believe my men have given no cause to make the blacks troublesome. I have always given my men positive instructions not to interfere with the blacks. They were so much alarmed on this occasion that I could hardly get them to go to the station again.
But this is the challenge for historians reading these testimonies. It's completely written from one side of the story.
John Coppock's nephew gives another perspective.
Coppock discovered that his men, like savages, were in the habit of shooting Aboriginal people on sight during his absence, killing men, women and children.
I grew up loving the legendary stories of the Anzacs, battling bravely on far distant shores. What I didn't fully realise until starting the story is how a very different but real war took place in our own Australian bush, and we just never heard much about it growing up. Or should we even call it a war, but rather something much darker? Letters to the editor of Sydney newspaper The Colonist.
But let me tell you that ways and means have not only been devised but practiced in this colony for removing those troublesome visitors.
Words cannot do justice to how appalling this is.
I have been informed on good authority that Stockman and others have often tried the experiment of mixing up arsenic in a damper, placed where the blacks were in the habit of frequenting.
It is horrendous. And then, on top of it, he calls the First Nations people
troublesome visitors.
That says a lot. Even this particular author could see this was not right.
No atrocities on the part of the blacks can, in my opinion, justify the whites in resorting to such treacherous means of retaliation. Assuredly, the end does not justify the means.
But he also summed up what Queen Victoria's pioneering settlers were feeling. They saw themselves as the victims.
But what can they, the whites, do? It is easy for men who have not suffered from the outrages to cant about the duty of treating them kindly. But is there no kindness or mercy to be shown to those white subjects whom necessity has driven far into the wilderness? Are their lives to be sacrificed without a single effort being put forth to save them? They have not only paid a certain sum, but they are the pioneers of civilization.
But what about John Coppock? Was he another of these murderous stockmen?
His nephew now makes pains to defend the reputation of his Uncle John.
He never allowed the Aboriginal people to be interfered with in his presence, unless in self-defense. But as he was often away, his men had ample opportunity to carry out these killings. He could not disarm them, as he was outnumbered 21-1, and they refused to leave their arms behind and attempt to make peace with the Aboriginal people.
So on the one hand, you've got the testimony of these settlers and tales of Europeans being attacked. And then the account from JCW that Coppock's ticket of leave men are indiscriminately shooting Aboriginal people. So now we come to the fateful day in John Coppock's life. So here, just beyond this river, comes a dramatic part of Coppock's life story. One that we wonder if it stayed with him for the rest of his days. So I'm here on the Colaban River, and not too far from here is the spot where on June 9th, 1838, a dramatic event happened. And there are different versions of what took place. With a bit of digging, we've managed to track down the actual words of John Coppock himself, along with that of two of his men.
I have the honour to report for the information of His Excellency the Governor. I sent out a summons to the Superintendent Mr. Coppock by some mounted police to attend here to inform me of the fact. I have now the honour to enclose Mr. Coppock's statement and will forward any others by the next post.
Let's let the defence give their version.
It's the 9th of June, 1838, and Samuel Footer, a ticket of leave man who arrived on the convict ship the Mangles, is now shepherding a flock of sheep on an outstation, 7 miles from the head one. It's a place just over the Colaban River. Another shepherd from Mr. Bowman's area suddenly rushes up alarmed.
There are some blacks here. I see the dogs.
We stood still, thinking at first they were coming to take their dogs off the sheep. But when they came 100 yards from us, they set up a shout and threw their skin cloaks off, and passing by their dogs ran towards us. They had, most of them, spears, some with several in one hand and a single one in the other.
So they've got 20 Aboriginal people approaching, spears in hand. They've got trained dingoes with them, and they've got all this history of other men being killed.
I then thought they intended to do me harm, particularly as they had killed a man of Mr. Bowman's 3 weeks before, and the other shepherds set off running.
It's fair to say this would be terrifying.
They pursued us as near as I can guess for 3/4 of a mile. The dogs killed 14 sheep whilst we were endeavouring to get them out.
John Pittman is watching.
I saw the natives come down off the ranges towards the sheep. They were extended as if they wanted to surround the men and sheep. I then saw the men run away and the blacks pursued them. I saw them run the 2 men to a creek and then return.
So you've got a close call. They've just managed to outrun the Aboriginal people. And now Footer rushes to John Coppock, and John himself tells his story.
On the 9th of the present month, one of the men in the employ of Mr. Yaldwyn came to me from an outstation. He said there had been the devil to pay, that the blacks had taken his flock of sheep and another of Mr. Bowman's, a neighbouring settler, and that the blacks had pursued him and made him leave the run.
At this point, all 3 stories are very similar, but the one that totally varies is the article from JCW written 47 years after the incident.
On visiting an outstation one day, Coppock was shocked to find the shepherd and watchman lying dead, speared and clubbed by Aboriginal people, and 1,200 sheep gone.
But this might be a mixing up of other stories. There is no other reference to a shepherd and a watchman lying dead. So here's where we're at. Sheep have been taken, a couple of shepherds have been given a massive fright. And what happens next is what is fiercely debated.
I immediately assembled 3 men and took them around to search for the sheep. I found several carcasses of sheep, some skinned, some cut up, and a great many totally destroyed. I there kept track of the sheep and followed it for about 4 miles when I came upon the blacks' camp.
So it's quite amazing after having researched this story for so long to actually now be on the road where all this happened, in the area where all this happened. Right now I'm hoping to get permission from the owners here as to whether we can film down there.
The Coloburn River.
That's the Coloburn down there.
So I met the owner, and he very kindly took me to the spot where this sad tale took place.
Well, my understanding is that it took place over on this next ridge in front of us.
Oh, right over here, where that tree is?
Yeah.
So here, on these hills, all those years ago, this tragic event took place.
It was then near sundown. The dogs we had with us began to bark, which caused the blacks to see someone was coming near them. They were at the time employed in completing a bowyard in which they had got the sheep secured. Upon seeing us, they immediately set up a great shout. Some others were round their fires. We were at this time about 400 yards from them, the 3 men who were with me, and 4 or 5 men of Mr. Bowman's, who had joined us whilst we were tracking the sheep. They, being upon the same purposes, ran towards the camp where the sheep were. I could not run so fast, and was considerably in their rear.
Mr. Coppock was rather behind the party when the men who were in front saw the blacks man their spears.
So at this point the Europeans claim they are being taunted.
As soon as the blacks saw us, they manned their spears and shouted and said, "Come on, white fellows." Some of them could speak a few words of English. The blacks again shouted to them to come on, and when they advanced, the blacks threw spears at them.
In the first instance, they threw up their hands and dared us to come on. Some said, "Come on, you white bees." I distinctly heard these words. They had in a manner fortified themselves behind fallen trees and sheets of bark.
So now the stories are a little hazy on the exact turn of events.
The men then fired at them and endeavoured to take the sheep, but could not on account of the spears that were thrown. When the white men fired, the blacks got behind trees and kept throwing their spears.
You can hear in Samuel Footer's account that he's pretty keen to justify himself and his mates.
Our men were mostly armed and fired at the blacks in return of the spears. I was on horseback and could not get very near as the horse was frightened.
Whilst the men were running up, one of the men fired a shot. I said, "This will make the blacks follow us." But instead of it having that effect, they immediately manned their spears and gave another shout, and instantly began throwing them at us. These spears dropped by us and passed, as we were obliged to shelter ourselves behind trees.
So while it's hard to know who threw the first spear or who fired the first shot, it's on.
We fired upon the blacks, and there was a regular engagement for about 3/4 of an hour when we rushed up to the fires to take possession of the place. When we got to the fires, the blacks had deserted them, but we saw them about 100 or 200 yards off, still in possession of the sheep. At the place where the blacks stood during the engagement, we found 7 or 8 blacks dead.
So here I am on the banks of the Coloburn River. It's beautiful country. There's hills around, clouds in the sky, amazing trees. But you just also know not too far from this spot is where around 187 years ago, several Indigenous Australians were killed through the white man's muskets. So regardless of how that happened, how malicious it was, we have to just acknowledge that.
Aboriginal people were killed
by white men with their guns.
We were fearful. The blacks would throw spears at us if we remained near the fires. We were therefore only a minute or two there. It was at this time quite dark, and we were afraid to make any further attempt to take the sheep. We therefore went home. The following morning I returned to the place where the engagement had taken place with 6 men. The blacks had disappeared, and we found the sheep a short distance off. We looked about in search of the blacks for about 4 miles, but could see nothing of them. In the camp, we found a great many sheep which had been killed. Some were cut up. I suppose there were at least 20 dead sheep there. When we went to the camp, the second day, we found the bodies of the blacks who had been killed had been put upon the fires and were partly consumed.
But how accurate is their story? Coincidentally enough, the day after, on June 10th, 1838, there was an infamous and horrible incident at Mile Creek. 28 Aboriginal people were brutally killed. And in that case, 7 of the perpetrators were convicted of murder and hanged. So there is a very real chance they could have faced tremendous consequences for what they did. And you can hear them at pains to express their innocence.
I went out with the party for the purpose of recovering the property and went armed to defend ourselves in the event of any attack upon us in doing so.
I heard no shot fired until the spears were thrown.
The attack was so sudden that we could not enter upon any explanation with the blacks. They set us at defiance from the first.
There was nothing said about shooting the blacks when we went to recover the sheep. All we wanted to was to get the sheep back.
I do not know who fired the shot, but there was nothing said before that anyone had any intention of firing upon the blacks.
I am certain it would have been quite impossible to have recovered the sheep without firing at the blacks. They would have speared every man attempting to go near them.
This is the 4th time sheep have been driven away by the blacks within a short period, but we never came upon the blacks. Only when they told us to come on, but I did not go near them.
Mr. Coppock is a friend to the blacks and has always given them food when they wanted it and treated them kindly.
The blacks have at different times robbed all our stations, except the home station, and have come in such numbers as to intimidate the people at them. I never knew of anything happening to cause the blacks to be unfriendly with our people. I do not know of any of the blacks who have been so troublesome.
So William Lonsdale from Lonsdale Street fame in Melbourne actually defends John Coppock and his men to a degree.
I am inclined to think these blacks are some of those who were concerned in the attack upon Mr. Faithful's party, and they have for some time past been very troublesome in the country about Mr. Yaldwyn's station. They disappear and return at unexpected periods.
So if you read these reports, you certainly get an impression the attempt was not malicious. It was a fight that broke out. If we look at it with European settler eyes, with the lens of other killings leading up to this, you can see how many would argue this wasn't a massacre. It was an attempt to recover sheep that went horribly wrong. But is that the full story? Is that the truth? Or is it a European fabrication of something that is much darker? They've given witness testimony, but are they lying? Their stories have similarities, but did they even get together and collude about what they'd say when questioned? Now ideally we'd start with eyewitness accounts, particularly from the Aboriginal people involved. If this Wikipedia article is right, these were actually the Jar Jar Rung people of the Loddon and Avoca rivers in the Bendigo region. But it doesn't seem their side of this event was recorded in the historic documents. But there are other voices. This is George Augustus Robinson. He was appointed Chief Protector of the Aboriginal people in 1839. He compassionately wanted to help the Aboriginal people and spent 10 years travelling through what is now Victoria, documenting the lives and the cultures of the Indigenous populations. So it's January 1840, and Robinson travels to the exact area where all this took place. And he makes this observation about the Europeans there, Yaldwyn and the 2 neighbours, Thornlow and Ebden.
3 individuals have 280 miles of country between them, and they think it a hardship if a native appears upon their run, imagining that a £10 licence gives them a legal right to expel the blacks.
And then comes his accusation.
I have not seen any natives since I have been out. What has become of the natives? Report says killed, and that there are plains called Waterloo Plains where Yaldwyn's people shot them.
So Robinson is far more brutal in his assessment of the Europeans. Perhaps that comes from his experience in other areas. But is this right? The last thing we want to do is excuse the guilty. And if this was a court case, we'd have the defence yelling out, "Hearsay." This is written over 1 year and 7 months after the event, based on an unknown someone. Is it fair in the various modern books and websites to condemn Coppock based on this? Nevertheless, Robinson goes on to provide the version he's heard.
After crossing the collar band, a short distance down to Munro Station, where there is an old deserted hut and a few hurdles. At the back of this hut, on a small hill, is the place where Bowman and Yaldwyn and Ebden's men shot the blacks down. This since called Waterloo Plains and Flat. Said when the men came up with the blacks called to them to come on and they would fight them. There were, I believe, 16 white men, all armed and for the most part mounted. They fired from their horses. The blacks were down in the hollow. They were out of the distance of spears. One old man kept supplying them with spears and was soon shot. Great many were shot. Some other blacks held up pieces of bark to keep off the balls, but it was no use. Some were shot dead with their bark in their hands.
So certainly if we were to base our decision on this testimony, as modern authors have done, it is appalling and malicious. But in the absence of better evidence, is our hearsay actually right? So now to the stand comes the second prosecution witness. And this one would cause a shocked groan throughout the courtroom. It is the nephew of John Coppock, John Coppock White. He makes his way to the stand, sharing his version. The version we assume was handed down to him from his uncle, writing this 47 years later in a paper.
Coppock gathered his men and plenty of ammunition, returned to the outstation, buried the two victims, and set out to recover the sheep. The trail was easily followed by the dead sheep left along the route. By nightfall, they came upon the Aboriginal camp with the sheep in the centre and fires all around. Coppock, deciding to give the Aboriginal people a lesson they wouldn't soon forget, divided his men into 4 groups. At his signal, they attacked, killing 23 Aboriginal people. The survivors fled, and the sheep were recaptured, though 300 were missing, presumed killed.
So again, a defence attorney would be yelling hearsay. On top of it, some of his opening testimony refers to the killing of 2 shepherds that were buried. There's no record of this anywhere else, not even by the men involved.
After this incident, there were no Aboriginal sightings in the area for a long time, suggesting the attack had been effective.
Probably says a lot about the cultural view at the time. To his nephew, writing this in a public newspaper, there isn't even a hint of shame in this. From his perspective, they were within their rights. So now we come to our third prosecution witness, Caroline Bowes, sister-in-law of Yaldwin. In about September 1838, she came to Barfold too.
The overseer complained about the blacks. They'd robbed the huts 3 times. Black fellows wanted the sheep. This was too much. Something had to be done. After 7 days they were found. Our party made them understand they must give up the sheep, when a spear came amongst our party, which greatly angered them, and being armed with muskets, they immediately fired. The blacks had never heard a gun fired, had no idea what it would do. One fine fellow stood up in front and put up his shield, which was a piece of bark off a tree, and one of these shots went through the shield and killed him. Then many were killed before our party got possession of the sheep.
That's a terrible account.
But there are holes in her story. She refers to Yaldwin being there, but we know he didn't arrive until a few months later. Also, the reference to looking for sheep for 7 days doesn't seem to match with the other accounts. She seems to be passing on second-hand information. Interestingly, her account sounds similar to Robinson's. So that's where we are left with this story. Europeans defending themselves.
I do not know who fired the shot, but there was nothing said before that anyone had any intention of firing upon the blacks.
And then several hearsay-type recollections.
Some other blacks held up pieces of bark to keep off the bulls, but it was no use. Some were shot dead with their bark in their hands,
suggesting that this was much more of a deliberate attack. Or was it even John Coppock's ticket to leave men, already described as ruffians, who were the ones that took it to a whole new level of violence? So I'm here on the banks of the Coppock River, and not far from here, on some hills back in this area back here, is where this horrible event took place all those years ago. And John, was it his ticket to leave men? Was he just trying to recover sheep? Was it something much more malicious than that? It's actually hard to know exactly what took place, but we acknowledge the pain of that, the hurt, and that at the end of the day, no matter how it happened, Aboriginal people were killed. Indigenous Australians were killed by white men and their muskets, their guns. But as for John Coppock himself, is there still some other parts of his story that don't add up?
His nephew claims he was a free settler.
We started searching the shipping records.
And here he is, John Coppock, arriving in 1829 on a ship, the Sarah. But here's the thing. This record is a transportation list for convicts. And here is his ticket of leave.
And then the coincidences start adding up.
The convict was tried at Chester, the county town of Cheshire. And Coppock of Albacutya came from Cheshire.
He came in a ship, the Sarah. His nephew, JCW, references the Sarah, but in a different context. John Coppock got a ticket of leave and went to Goulburn.
John Coppock of Albacutya leaves Goulburn.
Was John Coppock actually a convict? And his nephew, out of shame, covered this all up.
But then we put more pieces together.
The convict was only 18 when he came out, born in 1811, and he didn't leave Goulburn, and is buried at the Lake Bathurst Anglican Church. So it seems he's not the same John Coppock.
But curiously, online I couldn't find the grave amongst the headstones. But when did John Coppock arrive in Australia? Why is there no reference to this anywhere we can find? His death certificate gives us a clue of him arriving somewhere around 1833, but we just don't know for sure.
So if you find that, please let us know in the comments below.
There is a reference that when he first came to Australia, he was overseer with the MacArthurs of Camden.
So what's next for John Coppock?
A notice arrived requiring the entire party to attend court in Sydney to explain the incident. Fearing financial ruin if he left the station, Coppock decided not to attend. He wrote explaining that if they forced him to go to Sydney, it would result in the total loss of everything he had worked for.
But then apparently a notice arrives declaring if they don't attend, warrants will be issued for the entire party.
With no other option, they prepared to sacrifice everything. The livestock that couldn't be taken was turned loose. Coppock left Barfold, never to return.
So Coppock goes to Williamstown to sail to Sydney on a brig called the Sarah and face his judgment with the authorities.
The ship was ready to sail and waiting for a wind. Coppock, feeling cramped aboard, went ashore for a walk, where he met an old English acquaintance. They spent the evening reminiscing, got jolly, and decided to make a night of it. To Coppock's chagrin, the next morning he discovered that the Sarah had sailed during the night without him.
It does sound a little convenient if that is the case, that he missed the ship and his opportunity to report to authorities.
Strangely, from that day to this, nothing was ever heard of the Sarah, her crew, or passengers, and their fate remains a mystery.
Well, it turns out there was a 46-ton brig called the Sarah, and sure enough, it tragically disappeared at sea and was never heard from again.
It even features as number 1 on Heritage Victoria's top 20 of missing shipwrecks. A famous settler called Henry Howie from Gisborne was lost on that ship with his family.
So I'm standing here in Gisborne, and here right behind me is the statue to Henry Howie. He was lost on the Sarah, the same ship that John Coppock White claims John Coppock missed when he was at Williamstown. But the thing is, that ship left from Sydney, not Port Phillip, so it all seems just a bit odd.
He's listed as obtaining a pasturage licence in 1840, but instead heads in a completely new direction. So for the next chapter, I headed south towards Geelong.
So next, John Coppock gets a licence to run a pub at Little River.
I found a reference in a document called Tales of Taverns to this.
But it's George Coppock. Licensed to George Coppock in 1839.
Is that an error in this document? Or did John give his name as George?
We're right on site here at the Traveller's Rest, later called the Rothwell Inn.
You can still see these amazing ruins of the building today. But yet another research document conflicts with this and claims that Coppock's Inn was a different one, called the Little River Tavern. According to his nephew, it didn't go too well.
He was not long in finding out that the life of a publican did not suit him, but he carried on for a considerable time, in fact until his licence was cancelled.
JCW says there was an argument at a drunken wedding involving some officers of the police.
So then the next chapter.
After selling his property, Coppock returned to Melbourne, resolved in future to keep clear of the public house industry. In town, he became acquainted with a settler named Egerton from Tasmania.
So he strikes a deal with settler George Egerton, who had a pastoral run at Mount Egerton, which is still named after him today.
Being an uneducated man, Egerton wanted someone who could keep his books and write his letters, and he engaged Coppock. He had to mind the store and attend to a small flock of sheep, for which he was to receive a salary of 8 shillings per week, free tobacco, and the advantage of living with the boss thrown in.
Coppock even lends him some capital. So 8 years go by, described as 8 dull and uneventful years. He wants to make a push for himself.
As Egerton's affairs had not prospered, ready money was scarce. Sheep were of very little value.
So Coppock agrees to take what ready money could be raised, the remainder of the sheep, and sets off for the outer fringe of settlement again. So it's 1848, and he sets off with a party of bullocks, sheep, and some free, hard-working men in the direction of the Murray.
Although it was a much smaller party than the one he brought into the Port Phillip district from the Sydney side, the men were free and known to be decent, hard-working fellows.
In search of new land, they travel past the Richardson River, Fiery Creek, Mount Cole, and at last make it to the Wimmera River, and then Lake Hindmarsh.
One of the first settlers in that area was a Mr. Steiglitz, where they found a warm welcome.
The party were kindly received at Mr. Steiglitz's and invited to stay a short time to recruit, which offer was gladly accepted. Information was sought concerning the quality and capabilities of the country lying between this point and the Murray. Very little appeared to be known beyond the fact that there was plenty of dense mallee and heath out in that direction.
So we're walking through the kind of country that John Coppock would have walked through all those years ago.
So after a good rest, they came here along the edge of Lake Hindmarsh.
So we're walking through, this is Lake Hindmarsh. It's not much of a lake at the moment, it's pretty jolly dry. This track, it's actually leading us to Outlet Creek, which would flow out of Hindmarsh up towards Lake Albacutya.
And just to prove that water can actually make it here, this is a photo from 1996 when Mum and Dad visited Outlet Creek.
So I'm standing here at Outlet Creek, and so it was right here that all those years ago, John Coppock came through here, followed this creek up, walking through this kind of bush. John Coppock would have been coming through this very spot, along the edge of this outlet.
After travelling about 15 miles, they came to a large dry lake.
Lake Albacutya. It was dry, just like now.
It was judged from appearances that there had been no water in it for a great number of years. Over the bed of the lake was spread a thick sward of grass, interspersed with succulent herbage. It was first-class country for stock, evidently. Water for use was found along the outlet, but nothing permanent. There were many dry lakes and broad watercourses in the vicinity. Dingoes were plentiful and bold, and after following the explorers about all day, they would howl around the campfire all night.
So Coppock received a grant for the Albacutya block.
It was referenced as the Albacutya Run in 1848, with 30,000 acres and a grazing capacity of 6,000 sheep. A swaggy called George Everard later went on to work for Coppock and wrote a fascinating account of Albacutya Station.
The homestead appeared on a low ridge. It consisted of 5 huts and the store, all built of pine logs in American fashion, with roofs of bark. I went to the biggest building I saw, thinking it to be the boss's place. It proved to be the men's quarters, and the cook pointed out the master's quarters, a small hut of 1 room. I at once made my appearance before the boss, a big burly man with a clean-shaven face, and I gave him to understand that I was the new shepherd. I was told to go to the men's hut and take a day's spell, and at dinner time I found out the boss dined with the men, taking the head of the table and carving for about half a dozen of us. The dinner was damper and boiled mutton. The tea was made in a bucket, and everyone dipped their pannikins into it. The table was made of pine slabs 2 inches thick, and the seats were 2 rails resting in forks driven into the ground. Our community consisted of 6 all told, the boss and 5 others, 1 a bullock driver, 2 rouseabouts, another shepherd, and myself. As for the cook, I don't include him, being a regular duffer. He made our lives a misery. The boss had to put up with him, as there were no travellers ever passing. During my 6 months, there was only 1 man who passed with his swag. I commenced my work on the 3rd day. The boss came with me to the yard and counted out 2,200 sheep. He lent me his own dog I had an easy task with Jerry, the dog. The day passed at last, but I had come to the conclusion it could not be continued without books. I was wondering whether the boss had any, so the next morning I summoned up the courage to inquire. The boss was still in bed when I knocked at the door. He told me to come in, and he, pointing to a shelf, told me to help myself. There were about 100 books, and a poor lot they were. However, before my time expired, I had read them all over twice. As for news, we had to do without. There was no post office nearer than Lake Hanmarsh. During my first spell at Albacutya, we got news of the outer world twice. There were few incidents worth recording, just a monotonous routine of getting up, going out with the flock, eating meals, and sleeping.
And John Coppock White also gave a curious account of a mysterious creature.
In the lake tribe was a very old man who said he remembered the lake being dry when he was a little boy. There was water in one hole near the inlet, the resting place of the bunyip, which, he said, captured and made away with the natives who went there for water, until at last they became so much afraid that they would not go near the place. A great number perished for want of water in consequence.
We also get an idea of just how remote conditions were as one traveller tried to get from Albacutya to the Murray River.
It was very seldom anyone tackled the journey. One poor fellow attempted the job, got as far as Tiega, and caved in a mile or so beyond. A constable rode to the spot, scraped a hole with a stick, rolled the remains in, and covered it with earth.
So John continues to work into his old age at Albacutya Station. So is John a hero or a villain?
We get this description of a man of character from Everard.
Honest man, a just and true one he was. When he settled with a man, it was with orders on Holmes and White Geelong. He would fill in the pounds only, and would always manage to have a pile of silver and coppers so as to settle to the last penny.
His nephew also paints a picture of the local Aboriginal people, the Watchabollock people, as not feeling threatened by Coppock.
In the course of time, when they found they were not interfered with, they gained confidence and ventured about the camp.
And then also Coppock taking the time to learn their language.
Coppock knew a good deal of the language, but as there was a difference between their dialect and that of other Aboriginals amongst whom he had been, it was some time before he could converse freely with them.
And did John, in his later years, ever stop to reflect on his past and the events of the 9th of June, 1838? We get some insight from Everard.
I got on well with my boss, one of the quietest men I ever met. I have heard him give a description of his early struggles.
And then in recounting one event, he makes a profound reference to a character in an old book by Thomas Carlyle.
I never heard the boss laugh but on one occasion, but it was a laugh to remember. The cause was a blunder one of the hands made at the table. They were talking of the bunyip when one said he could not live in the water. He was contradicted by another, who said he could as he was an antibilious animal.
And Coppock laughs.
It put me in mind of Carlyle's description of Professor Teufelsdruck's. He shook like jelly all over.
Did this one rare burst of incredible laughter, like the character in the book, reveal something much deeper? A paradox, a contradiction to the pain, despair, and remorse for what had gone before.
So what of John Coppock? How did he live out his days?
He occupied Albacutya Run from the mid-1840s until his death in the early 1860s. And the story goes that John, who was getting on in years and was particularly unwell, one day dragged himself out of his bedroom onto the veranda, grabbed onto the veranda post, and he said to his nephew, "When I die, I want you to bury me over there near those trees." And the next day, or shortly thereafter, he died.
There, that will do. That is the last time I shall ever see the sun rise. John Coppock died June 30th, 1865, aged 70 years. An honest man.
So what do we make of the story of John? On one hand, we want to remember the legends of the pioneers.
We do have this incredible modern country, the envy of much of the world. And our current Australian society, with all of its conveniences and development, owes much to men like John Coppock, who did the hard yards of living rough, carving out life in a harsh landscape. But then we must never forget that this came with the cost of an entire culture, whether through diseases like smallpox, loss of traditional lands, or the reasons shared in the old poem. The squatter of the olden time. I'll sing to you a fine new song, made by my blessed mate, of a fine Australian squatter who had a fine estate, that by his rams, his ewes, his lambs, Australia was made great. But then, this line, who swore by right preemptive, at a sanguinary rate. What does that mean? And what story does that tell? Essentially, this famous squatter of the olden time declared this was his land, even if it came at a bloody cost. So what do we make of all this history?
How do we reconcile it?
I've heard the argument this happened long ago and we should just forget about it. But I don't see how we can just forget about it when the consequences of that time still linger.
I found this video really difficult to make because the topics are so sensitive, and it's sad to see how polarising some of these issues have become. I don't believe all of these settlers arrived with violent intentions. I guess most were simply focused on building a new life for themselves, for their families, believing that they were actually contributing to a better Australia. I am thankful to our pioneering forefathers. I don't think all of them were caught up in incidents like this. Many of them were just good, hard-working people. But it does seem that, especially in those frontier days, some horrible things did take place.
And there were certainly some deep assumptions about ownership and cultural superiority that went along with that colonial era.
As Robinson mentioned, settlers had paid their £10 licences, and in their minds that had justified their claim on the land.
And yes, there was sometimes violence from both sides.
Sad stories from these frontier times. And in amongst that, we recognise that it was the Europeans who had the guns, the power, and who were the ones colonising the land.
Hamilton, in his Pioneer book, summed it up when referring to the Hyman incident.
What happened that day is a scene of the past, and the curtain is drawn over it all. Perhaps part of the way forward is drawing back some of that curtain. To finish on a bit of a positive note, I found this painting.
It highlighted there were positive interactions between Europeans and the Indigenous Australians.
While we can't know for certain, it does seem even John Coppock had these too, positive interactions.
But of course, these alone do not redeem the past. Forgiveness and reconciliation needs to come from somewhere deeper.
I truly hope that as a nation we can reconcile our history, regardless of our background, our political leanings, learning from stories like that of John Coppock, and move forward with forgiveness, healing, and hope for the future, a better future. Thanks for watching.
There, that will do. That is the last time I shall ever see the sun rise.